What would you do if a flight attendant insulted you in front of a plane full of people? That's exactly what happened to one young couple. But just 5 minutes later, everything changed. The airline did something that shocked everyone on board. The flight attendant fired. But how did it all go down? You won't believe the twist that followed. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The plane had just taken off from Atlanta, and everything seemed like a normal flight. A smooth ride, light chatter, and the soft hum of the engines were all that filled the cabin. But no one expected that just a few rows away, a confrontation was about to unfold. A young couple, Chris and Tanya, settled into their seats, ready to enjoy the quiet hours ahead. They'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, hoping for a calm, relaxing flight. But what started as a small inconvenience quickly turned into something no one could have predicted. It began when Tanya politely asked the flight attendant, a woman named Karen, for a bit more room in the overhead compartment. The couple had a few bags and needed a little extra space, which didn't seem like too much to ask. However, Karen, who had been brisk and unfriendly from the start, gave Tanya a cold look. Without a word, she pointed to the far side of the plane, suggesting that there was room in another compartment. Tanya, not wanting to cause trouble, thanked her and moved over. But that's when it began to feel off. Karen's tone had been sharp, almost dismissive. Tanya exchanged a look with Chris, but neither of them said anything. They figured maybe the flight attendant was just having a bad day. However, things didn't stop there. As Karen walked back down the aisle a few minutes later, Tanya caught her eye, trying to smile and ease the tension. But Karen didn't return the smile. Instead, she snapped at them. "You should have thought about that before you boarded the plane." The words came out of nowhere, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Tanya froze, her smile faltering. Was this really happening? The sarcastic, almost mocking tone in Karen's voice left no room for misunderstanding. Chris, who had been quietly reading, looked up, his brow furrowed. Tanya, not one to back down, stood up and said, "Excuse me, did you just say that to us?" Karen didn't seem fazed. With a flick of her wrist, she muttered, "What's wrong?" Afraid of a little honesty? The word stung, sharper than anything Tanya could have imagined. She looked around, feeling the eyes of other passengers on her. Some were already whispering and others were clearly uncomfortable. Chris stood up next to her, his voice calm but firm. "There's no reason for that," he said, glancing at the other passengers. But Karen didn't seem to care. She just rolled her eyes, gave a dismissive wave, and walked off to serve the first-class passengers. Tanya sat back down, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She tried to shake it off, but the tension in the air was palpable. Chris turned to her, his face full of disbelief. "Did that really just happen?" he asked, shaking his head. Tanya nodded, but before she could say anything more, she saw one of the flight supervisors walking toward their seats. The supervisor, a man named Greg, had been quietly observing from the back of the cabin. Tanya and Chris exchanged a glance, unsure of what would happen next. Was the airline going to ignore this? Would they just let Karen get away with it? But as the supervisor stopped beside them, he didn't hesitate. He spoke with authority. "Can you tell me what happened?" Tanya, still in shock, explained the situation, recounting every word, every detail. As she spoke, Chris added his thoughts, his voice steady but angry. Greg nodded, taking it all in. "I'll take care of it," he said, before turning toward the galley where Karen had gone. The couple could only watch as Greg disappeared behind the curtain. For a moment, everything was silent. Passengers around them whispered, but there was an air of uncertainty. No one knew exactly what was happening, but one thing was clear. Something was about to change. Tanya looked at Chris again, her heart racing. "Do you think they'll do anything?" she asked quietly. Chris just shook his head, unsure. Neither of them expected what happened next. They had no idea that just a few minutes later, Karen's job would be on the line, and this flight would become a story no one would forget. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Tanya and Chris sat in their seats, hands clasped together, anxiously waiting for some kind of response. The passengers around them were quiet, sensing the growing tension in the air. They had all witnessed Karen's rude behavior, but no one seemed ready to speak up, unsure of how things would unfold. Chris leaned forward in his seat, looking toward the galley where the supervisor had gone. Tanya, trying to calm her nerves, fidgeted with the sleeve of her jacket, her thoughts racing. They had both been shocked by Karen's words, but now they wondered if anything would come of it. Just as the couple began to wonder if it had all been for nothing, the plane's intercom suddenly buzzed, cutting through the silence of the cabin. The captain's voice came through, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making a change in the cabin crew for the remainder of this flight. Please bear with us as we adjust." Tanya's eyes widened. "What's happening?" she whispered, looking at Chris. Before Chris could answer, the intercom crackled again, this time with the flight supervisor's voice. "We would like to inform you that the flight attendant who was previously serving this cabin will be removed from her duties for the rest of the flight. We thank you for your patience and cooperation." A stunned silence fell over the plane. Chris and Tanya exchanged looks, disbelief written across their faces. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The announcement was vague, but there was no mistaking it. Karen, the flight attendant, was being taken off duty. The other passengers looked around in confusion, some of them whispering, trying to figure out exactly what was going on. No one seemed to know for sure, but the tension had shifted. There was now a strange, almost uncomfortable sense of resolution in the air. Tanya felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also something else, vindication. Karen had insulted them, humiliated them in front of everyone, and now it seemed like the airline was taking the situation seriously. Chris, still processing the events, turned to Tanya. "I didn't think they'd actually do anything, but they did," he said quietly. "Yeah," Tanya replied, a small, almost bitter smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I didn't expect them to act so fast." The couple leaned back in their seats, both of them unsure of what would happen next. They'd been through a lot in the past few minutes, and yet they still didn't know how this story would end. Would Karen be completely removed from her job? Would the airline offer some sort of apology? Or would this be forgotten by the time they landed in New York? But before they could think much more on it, the door to the galley opened again. This time, it was not just the supervisor who walked out. 2 security personnel were with him, and they were leading Karen by the arm. Her face was red with anger, her eyes darting around the cabin as if looking for someone to blame. She didn't look at Tanya or Chris, but everyone on the plane knew why she was being escorted off. As they passed by the couple's seats, Tanya caught a glimpse of Karen's face, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. The flight attendant didn't say a word. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. Instead, Karen's expression was one of pure disdain, her shoulders stiff as she walked by. Tanya couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction as she watched Karen being led down the aisle. It was a strange feeling. Justice, maybe. But it didn't make her forget what had been said, what had been done. Still, it was clear that the airline wasn't going to let this slide. As Karen disappeared into the rear of the plane, the flight supervisor returned to the front. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, but the couple knew something had shifted. Chris turned to Tanya again. "I guess that's it," he said, his voice softer now. "I never thought she'd actually be fired." Tanya shook her head slowly, still processing it all. "I don't know if she's fired for good, but they definitely made an example of her." And just like that, in a matter of minutes, the power had shifted. What had started as a small request for some extra space in the overhead compartment had turned into a moment that no one on board would ever forget. As the plane cruised steadily above the clouds, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense but oddly expectant. Passengers who had been whispering among themselves began to settle down, their curiosity piqued by the strange turn of events. Some were still talking about what had happened. exchanging thoughts on Karen's behavior, while others simply sat back, trying to return to their own quiet worlds. But for Chris and Tanya, the events of the last few minutes lingered in their minds. They sat in silence for a moment, both still processing everything. Chris leaned back in his seat, staring at the seat back in front of him, lost in thought. Tanya, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over yet. The announcement had come. Karen had been escorted off the plane, and everything seemed like it was winding down. But something inside her told her that this was just the beginning. "Do you think she'll be back?" Tanya asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was quieter now, more contemplative. Chris shook his head. "I don't think so. They wouldn't make an announcement like that if they were planning to just let her return." He paused. "But I'm still surprised they acted so fast. I thought they'd at least try to talk to her first, or, I don't know, brush it off." Tanya nodded slowly. "Yeah, it was pretty quick. I wasn't expecting it to happen like this. I thought we'd have to deal with her the whole flight. But we don't," Chris replied, his voice firm. "And that's what matters." Tanya smiled faintly, though her mind was still racing. She kept thinking about what had happened just moments before. Karen's rude comments, her dismissive attitude, the way she had mocked them so openly. Tanya had been caught off guard, but now that it was over, she realized how much that moment had taken out of her. The insult had been sharp, cutting deeper than she'd expected, and she wasn't sure why it had affected her so much. "You know," Tanya said after a pause, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've never had anyone treat me like that before." She looked over at Chris, and I don't know why it hit so hard. It was just so unnecessary. Chris reached over and took her hand. "It's not you, Tanya. It's her. Some people think they can talk to others like that because they think they can get away with it. It's not about you, it's about her." Tanya nodded, but the sting of the words still lingered. "I just didn't expect it from someone who's supposed to be there to help. I mean, it's literally her job to make people comfortable. How do you go from helping to, well, that?" Chris squeezed her hand gently. "It doesn't make sense. But what matters is that you stood up for yourself. You didn't let her get away with it." Tanya smiled a little. "Yeah, I guess I did, but honestly, I didn't even have to do much. The airline took care of it. I just had to tell the supervisor what happened." Chris chuckled. "Well, you're not the only one. I think most of the passengers were watching that unfold too. Everyone knew she was in the wrong." Tanya looked around the cabin, realizing that Chris was right. Many of the passengers had been watching, and even though no one had stepped in to intervene, it seemed like they all understood the injustice of what had happened. Some passengers were still casting glances at her, clearly uncomfortable, while others had leaned in, waiting for some kind of resolution. In a strange way, the whole plane had been part of this moment. Tanya and Chris had been the target, but everyone had felt the shift in the air as Karen was taken off the plane. As the minutes ticked by, the couple noticed that the flight attendants who replaced Karen were much more professional, much more polite. They smiled, interacted with passengers warmly, and moved through the aisles without the air of superiority that Karen had carried with her. It was clear that the atmosphere on the plane had changed, and everyone seemed to relax just a little bit more. Tanya felt a small sense of relief wash over her. The plane ride, which had begun with so much tension, was now starting to feel normal again. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the steady hum of the engine soothe her nerves. It wasn't the trip she had imagined, but it was almost over. The only question left now was what would happen when they landed. Would Karen be waiting for them at the airport, ready to make her case? Or had the airline already taken their steps to deal with the situation once and for all? They would find out soon enough. But for now, the plane glided smoothly toward New York. The last stretch of the flight passed without incident, but the unease still lingered in the air. Tanya and Chris had settled into a quiet lull, their minds slowly unwinding from the events that had just unfolded. Outside the window, the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow across the horizon. The steady hum of the engines was almost comforting now, but the reality of what had happened earlier kept replaying in their minds. Despite the calm, neither of them could fully relax. As the plane started its descent into New York, the captain's voice came through the intercom, calmly announcing their arrival. But Tanya and Chris barely heard him. They were too caught up in what might happen next. Would the airline address the situation when they landed? Would Karen be waiting for them, her story ready to be told? Or would it all just be swept under the rug, a blip in an otherwise routine flight? When the plane touched down, a quiet wave of relief spread through the cabin. The passengers, many of whom had witnessed the tension, stood up and began gathering their belongings, as if the strange event was already becoming a distant memory. But for Tanya and Chris, the story wasn't over yet. They exchanged one last glance, both unsure of what would happen once they reached the gate. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Tanya noticed two things. First, there were airport security officers standing near the door to the jet bridge, and second, a group of airline representatives stood by the gate waiting. She couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach. What was this all about? Once the plane had come to a complete stop, the passengers began to deboard. Tanya and Chris stood up, grabbed their bags, and made their way down the aisle. The security officers and airline staff watched carefully as passengers filed out. Tanya noticed one of the security officers eyeing her and Chris closely, and it made her feel like they were under some kind of investigation, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. When they finally reached the gate, one of the airline representatives stepped forward. The woman, in her mid-30s and wearing a sharp blazer, looked at them with a serious expression. "Are you the couple who reported the flight attendant's behavior?" she asked. Tanya nodded. "Yes, we are." The woman smiled, though it wasn't the kind of smile that offered comfort. It felt more like a polite formality. "Please follow me. We need to speak with you for a moment." Tanya and Chris exchanged another glance. This wasn't what they had expected. They'd thought they would be free to go, that everything would be over once the plane had landed. Instead, they were being pulled into what seemed like some kind of formal discussion. They followed the representative through the terminal, past the bustling crowd of travelers, until they reached a small office at the back of the gate area. Inside, the airline staff was already gathered, along with a man Tanya assumed was the manager. The woman who had spoken to them motioned for them to sit down. "Thank you for your patience," she said, her voice much softer now. "We take these matters very seriously, and we want to ensure that this issue is fully addressed." Tanya and Chris sat down, their curiosity now mixed with a hint of apprehension. The manager, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, looked at them with a serious expression. "We want to apologize for the behavior of our flight attendant," he said. "What she said to you was completely unacceptable, and it does not reflect the standards we uphold as an airline. Rest assured, we are taking immediate action." Tanya wasn't sure how to respond. She had expected some kind of apology, but hearing it in such formal terms felt almost too detached. Chris, however, leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean by immediate action?" he asked. The manager nodded. "We've already begun an internal review. We will be taking appropriate disciplinary measures against the flight attendant, and we will make sure that she is no longer part of our crew moving forward." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We are deeply sorry for your experience and any discomfort it caused." Chris and Tanya sat in stunned silence. The words were almost too much to process. Karen, the woman who had treated them with such disrespect, was going to be removed from her job. It was something they hadn't expected to hear, and it left them both feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and uncertainty. They'd spoken up, and now it seemed like the airline was doing more than just acknowledging the issue. They were taking it seriously. But it also left them with questions. Was this really the right move? Would Karen lose her job over this? Would there be more consequences? The manager continued, "We will also be issuing you a formal apology and offering you compensation for the inconvenience. We want to make this right." Tanya looked at Chris, who gave a small nod. "Thank you," Tanya said, though her voice was quiet. "We just wanted to make sure something was done. It shouldn't have happened in the first place." "We understand," the manager replied. "And again, we apologize. You were treated unfairly, and we are taking the necessary steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." After a few more minutes of discussion about the compensation process, the manager stood up. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to reach out. We value our passengers, and we're committed to providing the best possible service." Tanya and Chris stood up, feeling a sense of closure beginning to settle over them. As they walked out of the office, Tanya glanced at Chris. "I still can't believe it," she said. "I didn't think they'd actually do something like this." Chris smiled. "Neither did I, but it's over now." As they left the terminal and headed toward the exit, the weight of the situation seemed to lift. What had started as a moment of discomfort had ended with the airline taking action. But as they stepped into the bright lights of New York, Tanya couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would this incident haunt her? Would Karen ever find another job in the industry? She didn't know. But one thing was for sure. She and Chris would never forget the flight that had changed everything. The days following the flight passed quickly, but Tanya and Chris couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered from their encounter with Karen. It was like the whole experience had left an imprint on them. On the surface, everything seemed fine. Life went on, and they carried on with their trip. But beneath the surface, there was an unease that neither of them could fully explain. Tanya tried to focus on the sights and experiences they had come to New York for. She marveled at the skyscrapers, the rush of people walking through Times Square, and the bright lights that seemed to pulse with energy. Chris, ever the optimist, urged her to enjoy the city, and for the most part she did. They ate at great restaurants, saw a Broadway show, and even took a ferry ride around the Statue of Liberty. But no matter how beautiful the city was, there was still that gnawing feeling of what had happened on the flight. It wasn't until a few days later, when they were back in their hotel room after a long day of sightseeing, that the reality of the situation started to sink in. Tanya's phone buzzed on the bedside table. She picked it up and saw an email from the airline, titled, "Follow up on your recent flight incident." She stared at the subject line for a moment, unsure whether she wanted to open it. But curiosity got the best of her and she tapped the screen. The email was long, but as Tanya skimmed through it, her eyes widened with each line. The airline had gone beyond just offering an apology. They had also followed through on their promise of compensation, offering them a travel voucher worth several $100s. Tanya hadn't expected that much, considering everything that had happened. But there it was in black and white. Not only that, but the airline had also confirmed that Karen had been permanently removed from the flight crew roster. The email even mentioned that she had been retrained to handle customer service situations more effectively in the future. Tanya put the phone down and looked at Chris, who was sitting across from her, scrolling through his own phone. "You won't believe this," she said, showing him the screen. Chris read through the email quickly, his brow furrowing as he processed the details. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "I didn't think they'd go this far." Tanya nodded. "Neither did I. But I guess they're really serious about making things right." She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. A part of her had been skeptical. Had the airline really done enough? Had Karen really faced the consequences she deserved? The letter seemed to answer those questions, and Tanya felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the compensation, it was about the principle of it. The airline had acted decisively, showing that they wouldn't tolerate behavior like Karen's. But as the relief settled in, another question popped into Tanya's mind. Was that the end of it? Would the story end here? Or would there be more to uncover in the days that followed? She couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Karen's story than just a single incident. Had she been dismissed because of this one act? Or had there been other complaints against her that the airline hadn't disclosed? Tanya didn't know, but she had a feeling that they might never know the full truth. Still, as she looked at Chris, she realized that whatever happened, it didn't change the fact that they had stood up for themselves. They hadn't let Karen's words slide, and in the end, it had made a difference. For Tanya, that was enough. Chris noticed the look on her face and smiled. "You okay?" he asked. Tanya nodded. Yeah, it's just strange, you know? I thought we'd just get an apology and move on, but this feels like so much more. Like, we really changed something. You did, Chris said, his voice firm. You stood up for yourself, and it mattered. Tanya smiled, feeling a small wave of pride wash over her. It had been a tough few days, but they had handled it. And now, with everything that had been done, she felt like the weight of the whole situation was starting to lift. As the night wore on, Tanya and Chris sat on the bed, talking about their plans for the rest of their trip. The email from the airline had put a final bow on the experience, and it was time to move on. But in the back of Tanya's mind, the story wasn't over just yet. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Karen try to challenge her dismissal? Would this become a bigger story? Only time would tell. But for now, they were just two people on vacation, trying to enjoy New York without any more surprises. The days in New York went by quickly, and Tanya and Chris found themselves slipping into a comfortable rhythm again. They explored more of the city, taking walks through Central Park, visiting museums, and enjoying a few lazy afternoons at local cafes. The incident with the flight attendant was starting to fade into the background, just another strange moment in an otherwise enjoyable trip. But every now and then, the thought of what had happened would creep into their minds. It wasn't something they could fully forget. It had left its mark, even though the airline had taken swift action. But life, as it often does, moved forward. It was the evening before they were scheduled to fly back home to Atlanta when the call came. Tanya's phone buzzed as she sat at a small outdoor cafe, sipping a coffee and looking out at the street. She picked it up, expecting a normal call or maybe a message from a friend. But when she saw the caller ID, her heart skipped a beat. It was the airline. "Hello?" she answered, her voice calm but with a hint of surprise. "Good evening, Ms. Davis," the voice on the other end said. "This is Robert from United Airlines, following up on your recent experience with one of our flight attendants. I wanted to make sure you were satisfied with the resolution we've provided and see if you had any other concerns or feedback." Tanya looked at Chris, who raised an eyebrow. She gestured for him to be quiet, then took a deep breath before speaking. "Yes, I received your email. Everything seems fine now. The compensation was appreciated, and I understand that Karen's been removed from duty." "Glad to hear that," Robert said. "I just wanted to inform you that we've also launched a broader review of our flight crew training and customer service standards following this incident. It's a part of our ongoing efforts to improve and ensure something like this doesn't happen again." Tanya felt a small pang of surprise. "A broader review? I didn't know that was part of the process." "We take customer feedback very seriously," Robert continued. "And as part of that review, we've decided to implement additional training for our entire flight staff. It's not just about handling difficult passengers, but ensuring that every member of our crew is treating all passengers with respect and professionalism. We're looking at ways to make sure no one feels the way you did during your flight." Tanya's mind was racing. She hadn't expected the airline to go this far. They had already taken action against Karen, but now they were taking steps to overhaul their entire crew's approach to customer service. Part of her felt good about this. It was reassuring to know that the airline was using this situation as an opportunity for change, even if it wasn't just about them. But another part of her was still unsure. Would it really make a difference? Or was it all just a way for the airline to cover their bases? "That's good to hear," Tanya said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I appreciate you keeping me in the loop." "Of course," Robert replied. "We just want to make sure that you and all of our passengers feel comfortable and valued while flying with us. If you have any further concerns or if you need anything else, please don't hesitate to reach out." Tanya glanced at Chris again, who was now listening intently. "Thanks for letting me know," she said. "And I'll definitely keep that in mind." "Thank you, Ms. Davis. Safe travels, and we hope to welcome you back aboard soon." With that, the call ended. Tanya stared at her phone for a moment, processing what had just been said. A broader review, additional training. It all sounded like a big deal. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or skeptical. She hadn't expected the airline to go to such lengths, but then again, she wasn't sure if it was truly going to result in any lasting change. She turned to Chris. "Well, that's new," Tanya said, her voice still tinged with disbelief. "They're launching a whole review of their training and customer service practices." Chris raised his eyebrows. "That's a big move." "Yeah," Tanya said, half smiling. "They said it's part of their efforts to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. I don't know if that's just lip service or if they're really doing something about it." Chris thought for a moment before answering. "I think it's good. I mean, even if it's not all about us, at least they're taking it seriously. I wouldn't have expected them to go that far." Tanya nodded slowly. "True, but, part of me wonders if they're just trying to cover their tracks. Like, are they doing this because of us, or because they've had other complaints like this?" "Maybe both," Chris said with a shrug. "Either way, I guess it's a step in the right direction." Tanya didn't respond immediately. She thought about the call, about the promises the airline had made. It was easy to get lost in the details, to question whether it would actually lead to any change. But for now, she had to admit that this was a significant step forward. Whether it would have an impact or not, only time would tell. As they finished up their coffee and began to pack up for their flight home, Tanya couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something about the whole situation that felt like it had more layers to uncover. Would the airline follow through on their promises? Would Karen's dismissal be the last of it? She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. Whatever happened next, this experience had changed something in her, and she wasn't about to forget it anytime soon. The flight back to Atlanta was uneventful, a stark contrast to the chaos of their previous journey. Tanya and Chris boarded the plane with the same mixture of anticipation and relief that had followed them throughout their trip. Despite the closure they felt from the airline's response, there was still a part of Tanya that couldn't completely shake the unsettling feeling that lingered after the encounter with Karen. She wondered if it would fade with time, or if it would stay with her longer than she expected. As they settled into their seats, Tanya found herself scanning the cabin, almost expecting to see some sign of the situation's aftermath. Would Karen's face appear at the front of the plane, perhaps in a different uniform? Would anyone bring up the incident during the flight? But of course there was nothing, just the usual crew members, going about their duties as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. They tried to focus on the present, the comfort of the seat, the hum of the plane and the soft chatter around them. Still, Tanya couldn't help but think back to the phone call from the airline, the promises they'd made about revamping their customer service training. What kind of real change would come from it? And would the airline actually keep up its word, or was this just another public relations move designed to smooth things over? Chris leaned over, sensing her unease. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft. Tanya sighed, rubbing her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. I just can't stop thinking about it all. The airline's doing all these things to make sure it doesn't happen again, but I still don't know if it's enough. It feels like a lot of it is just talk. Maybe I'm just overthinking it." Chris nodded, understanding. "I get it. I think you're just trying to figure out what's real and what's not. I mean, it's not easy to just let something like that go, especially when you don't know if it's actually going to lead to anything meaningful." "I know," Tanya said, looking out the window at the endless stretch of clouds. "I guess I want to believe that it's going to make a difference. But there's part of me that wonders if Karen's just one bad apple, What if the rest of the crew is just as bad, and this was just the one time someone got caught?" Chris shook his head. "I don't think that's the case. If it were, the airline wouldn't be making these changes. They're not doing all this just because of one incident. They've got a bigger picture in mind." Tanya thought about that for a moment. He was right in a way. The airline wasn't just addressing Karen's actions. They were acknowledging a larger issue, something systemic. If they were willing to take the time to reassess their training, to overhaul their approach to customer service, maybe there was hope for change after all. But it still felt strange, like an unfinished story that hadn't fully wrapped itself up. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Tanya felt a growing sense of finality. They were headed home, and this chapter of their trip was about to close. The flight had ended without incident, and the follow-up with the airline had given them the resolution they needed, at least in a way. They had stood up for themselves, spoken up when something was wrong, and seen real action taken as a result. But was that the end of it? Was it really over? As they touched down and made their way through the airport, Tanya found herself thinking about the flight attendants who had been kind and professional throughout their trip. She thought about how different they had felt compared to Karen. Maybe not all airline staff were like her. Maybe most of them genuinely cared about their passengers. It was hard to say, but Tanya couldn't help but feel grateful that she and Chris had been treated well on the way back. At least that part of the journey felt like it was on the right track. Walking out into the bright sunlight of Atlanta's airport, Tanya took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what would come of the airline's changes. Maybe they would follow through, or maybe things would go back to business as usual. She hoped for the best. But either way, she felt like she had learned something important through the experience. The power of speaking up, the ability to demand respect, and to stand firm when something wasn't right. It wasn't just about this one flight or this one interaction. It was about taking control of your own narrative, your own comfort, and not letting anyone trample over your dignity. Tanya glanced at Chris, who smiled at her with an understanding that said it all. They had made it through this together, and now they could put it behind them. For now. But deep down, Tanya knew one thing for sure. This story wasn't truly over yet. Whether or not Karen would face more consequences, or if the airline's changes would be enough to prevent future incidents, she didn't know. What she did know was that things had shifted, both in her and in the way the airline handled the situation. She just hoped it wasn't all temporary. The real test would be whether the changes they promised would last beyond the headlines. For now, though, they were home, and that was enough. A week passed since they returned to Atlanta, and life slowly settled back into its usual pace. Tanya and Chris returned to their everyday routines, work, socializing with friends, and all the little things that make up life. Yet as much as they tried to move on, the story was never far from Tanya's mind. It lingered in the background like a loose thread she couldn't quite pull out. One afternoon, as Tanya sat at her desk at work, her phone buzzed with a notification. She picked it up and saw a headline from a local news outlet. Flight attendant fired after alleged racially charged incident on flight. Her heart skipped a beat. The article's lead photo showed a generic image of an airplane, but the headline immediately grabbed her attention. Could it be about her flight? She clicked on the link, her fingers trembling slightly. The article detailed an incident aboard a United Airlines flight where a flight attendant, identified only as Karen, had allegedly insulted a couple during a routine interaction. The article didn't name Tanya or Chris, but the description of the event, the request for extra space in the overhead compartment, followed by a sharp, rude remark and the ensuing conflict, sounded eerily familiar. As Tanya read on, she learned that after the incident was reported, the flight attendant was removed from the crew and subsequently dismissed from her duties. Tanya felt a cold shiver run down her spine. So the story had gotten out. The article explained how the airline had launched an internal investigation, apologized to the couple involved, and even promised a revamp of their training procedures. The airline spokesperson had emphasized that such behavior was unacceptable and reaffirmed their commitment to customer service. While the piece didn't delve into much personal detail about the couple, no mention of names, no specifics beyond the facts, Tanya knew that the article was referring to them. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Part of her felt relief. The story was out there now, and the public knew what had happened. There was no turning back. Karen's actions, her attitude, had been exposed for what they were. The more she thought about it, the more Tanya realized that this was a kind of closure, even if it was unexpected. It wasn't just about her and Chris anymore. The whole situation had been turned into something bigger, something that others could learn from. But another part of Tanya felt uneasy. She couldn't help but wonder how Karen was doing. Had the flight attendant been unfairly portrayed in the press? Did people understand the full context of the situation, or was it just another headline to grab attention? Tanya's thoughts were interrupted by a buzz from her phone. This time it was a text from Chris. "Did you see the news article?" Tanya quickly typed back, "Yeah, just saw it. Crazy, right?" She stared at the phone for a moment, then added, "I wonder how Karen's feeling about all this." Chris replied quickly, "Honestly, I'm not sure I care." She crossed a line and the airline took action. She got what she deserved. Tanya sat quietly for a second, considering his words. Chris was right, of course. Karen had been unprofessional, disrespectful, and rude. She'd insulted them in front of a plane full of people. She'd made them feel small, unwelcome, and uncomfortable. The actions that followed were justified, and Karen had faced the consequences for her behavior. There was no question about that. Still, Tanya couldn't shake the lingering sense of sympathy for her. The whole situation had escalated so quickly. Could things have gone differently if Karen had handled it better? If she'd taken a moment to step back, to listen? Tanya sighed, leaning back in her chair. She knew that it wasn't her job to dwell on Karen's feelings or her future. What mattered was that they had spoken up, that they hadn't let the disrespect slide, and the airline had listened. In the end, that was the most important thing. Karen's actions had led to real change, both for her and the airline. A few minutes later, Chris texted again. "Maybe it's time we let it go. We did what we had to do, now we can move on." Tanya stared at the text for a moment before she typed her reply. "Yeah, you're right. It's just strange, you know. It feels like this whole thing happened in another life. But I guess I'll be thinking about it for a while. I get it, but just think of it this way. What happened to us won't happen to anyone else if the airline does what they promised. And that's something good." Tanya smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She had been caught up in the complexity of the situation, overthinking every angle. But Chris was right. It wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that people weren't treated the way they had been treated. The bigger picture mattered more than the small details. She put her phone down, took a deep breath, and went back to work. The whole situation, as strange and unsettling as it had been, had ultimately pushed them towards something bigger. A change in how people treated one another, especially in spaces where power dynamics played a huge role. The airline had acted, and it was clear that their voices, her voice, had made a difference. And though it would take time for the story to fully fade, Tanya realized one thing. They had turned a negative experience into something meaningful, something that had the potential to ripple outward and inspire others to stand up for themselves. Maybe that was the real victory. A few weeks passed, and life seemed to fall back into its usual rhythm. Tanya and Chris returned to their regular routines: work, friends, the occasional weekend getaway. But every now and then something would remind them of the flight. It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was the sound of a flight attendant's voice over a loudspeaker, or the sight of someone adjusting their seat on a plane. Those little reminders would bring them back to that moment, the tension in the air, the sting of the insult, and the feeling of being powerless. But slowly, the weight of it all started to lift. The constant thoughts about Karen and the airline's response began to fade, replaced by the comfort of the familiar. Tanya found herself getting back into the swing of things, her days a bit brighter. The unease that had once lingered in her mind slowly dissolved as time went on. She could look back on the situation with a sense of closure, knowing that she and Chris had done what was right. And while she didn't expect to forget the incident entirely, it no longer consumed her thoughts. Then, one afternoon, out of the blue, Tanya received a call. It was from an unfamiliar number, and for a moment, she hesitated. Was it the airline again? Or perhaps another follow-up on the situation? She picked up. "Hello?" Tanya said, a little warily. "Hi, is this Tanya Davis?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yeah, this is Tanya," she replied, sitting up straight. Her heart rate ticked up a notch. "Who's calling?" "This is Robert from United Airlines again," he said, sounding polite but formal. "I'm calling to follow up with you one last time regarding the incident aboard Flight 2422. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Tanya paused for a moment. "No, it's fine. What's this about?" "I wanted to personally thank you once again for your patience and for reporting the situation," Robert continued. "As part of the follow-up process, we've conducted a full review of the flight crew's actions that day, as well as the overall situation. We value your feedback and wanted to inform you that we've implemented even more extensive changes beyond the initial training improvements we mentioned before." Tanya's curiosity piqued. "More changes?" "Yes, exactly. After further internal discussion, the airline's leadership has decided to introduce a broader customer service initiative across the company. This includes a new set of standards for handling conflicts, with a specific focus on cultural sensitivity and inclusion training for all flight staff. It's a direct response to the feedback we received from passengers, including your experience." Tanya blinked, absorbing the information. "So you're saying the whole company is going through this?" "That's right," Robert said. "This isn't just about a single incident. It's part of a company-wide effort to make sure that every passenger feels valued and respected, no matter the circumstances. We know that we've fallen short in the past, and we want to ensure that we are setting the right example moving forward." Tanya couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. She'd expected the changes to be limited to a few flight attendants, some training modules for the crew, maybe even a press release or two. But this sounded like a complete overhaul of their customer service approach. She felt a knot form in her stomach, but this time it was a knot of something more like satisfaction. It seemed like the airline was taking this seriously, far more seriously than she'd anticipated. "So, this is a company-wide initiative now?" Tanya asked. "And it's directly related to the incident that happened on our flight?" "That's correct," Robert confirmed. "We're fully committed to making sure our customers feel heard and respected. This initiative is just the beginning. There are also plans for new feedback systems where passengers can directly communicate their experiences, good or bad, to help us better track where we need to improve. It's part of a broader cultural shift within United Airlines, and we're excited to see where it leads." Tanya was silent for a moment, processing everything. "I didn't expect all of this. Honestly, I thought this would be one of those things where we get an apology, a small gesture of compensation, and then it's over. But this feels like real change." "We believe it is," Robert said warmly. "And we truly appreciate you bringing this matter to our attention. You and Chris helped us identify something we didn't fully realize was an issue, and for that, we're grateful." Tanya felt a wave of relief, followed by a strange sense of pride. She had doubted whether anything substantial would come of the airline's promises, but it seemed like they were going above and beyond. For the first time since the incident, she felt that all the uncertainty, the anger, and the frustration had led to something positive. It was one thing to make a change for the better. It was another to make a lasting change that could impact hundreds of people moving forward. "So, what's the next step?" Tanya asked, still a little in disbelief. "What happens now?" "Now, we're continuing with the training, ensuring it's being applied effectively across the board," Robert explained. "And we're committed to following through on the promises we made to you. If you ever feel the need to reach out, to offer more feedback or insight, you can always contact us directly. You've been an important part of our improvement process, and we want to make sure we keep that line of communication open." Tanya smiled, a genuine warmth filling her chest. "Thank you, Robert. I wasn't expecting to hear all of this, but it's good to know that something good came out of this situation." "We couldn't agree more, Tanya. Thank you for your time today, and we hope to welcome you back on board in the future, under much better circumstances, of course." After hanging up, Tanya sat back in her chair, the weight of the conversation settling in. She glanced over at Chris, who had been listening in on the call. "Well, that was unexpected," Tanya said, her voice a little shaky from the mix of emotions. Chris grinned. Yeah, no kidding. It sounds like they're actually doing what they said they would. This could change a lot for them. Tanya nodded, still processing it all. It feels like something bigger than just us now. Like we were part of something that could really make a difference for people in the future. Chris gave her a knowing look. You were, and I think you'll always remember that. Tanya smiled softly. Yeah, I guess I will. And with that, for the first time in weeks, Tanya felt truly at peace with everything that had happened. It wasn't just about what had been taken from them during that flight. It was about what had been given back, a chance for change. Something that had seemed small and personal had, in the end, reached further than she could have ever imagined. The days after Tanya's call with Robert were filled with an unexpected sense of closure. The phone call had been the final piece of the puzzle for Tanya. The airline had genuinely followed through on their promises, and it seemed that the impact of what had happened on that flight would ripple far beyond her and Chris. She couldn't help but think back to that moment on the plane, when she'd first realized that something wasn't right. When Karen's words cut through the air like a blade, and they'd felt so small, so powerless. But now, looking back, Tanya saw something different. She saw how quickly everything had changed once they spoke up. The moment hadn't just been a low point. It had sparked a much-needed conversation about respect, professionalism, and how people should treat one another in spaces where power dynamics are at play. It had turned into a movement, a quiet revolution within an airline, one that started with two people standing up for themselves. Chris, too, seemed to feel the weight of what had happened. While Tanya had been quietly processing everything, he had been more outwardly proud of how things had turned out. He often brought it up during their casual conversations, making sure to highlight the broader implications of the change. You know, I think we've done something bigger than we realize, he would say with a grin, always able to look at things from a hopeful angle. Tanya, on the other hand, couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was still something unfinished about the whole experience. It wasn't about Karen anymore, or even about the airline. It was about how one seemingly small moment could grow into something that challenged an entire system. She had never thought of herself as an advocate, let alone someone who could spark real change, but now she felt like she was part of something much bigger. One afternoon, while Tanya was at home catching up on emails, she received another message from the airline. This time, it wasn't a call, but a letter. The subject line read, "A personal thank you from United Airlines." Her heart skipped as she opened the email. It was from the same representative, Robert, and it read, "Dear Tanya, we wanted to take a moment to express our sincere appreciation for your courage and integrity in bringing your experience to light. Thanks to you and your thoughtful feedback, we have made significant strides in improving our customer service training and policies. As a token of our gratitude, we would like to offer you 2 round-trip tickets on any domestic United Airlines flight of your choice. We believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, and your actions have helped reinforce that commitment across our company. Please enjoy these tickets as a reminder of your contribution to a better flying experience for all." Tanya stared at the email, the words sinking in slowly. She hadn't expected anything like this. A gift, something so generous, as if her actions had truly made a difference. She showed the email to Chris, who was equally surprised. "Wow, 2 round-trip tickets?" Chris asked wide-eyed. "That's a pretty big thank you." "I wasn't expecting anything," Tanya replied, a mix of disbelief and gratitude in her voice. "But it's kind of nice to know that the airline is really serious about what they've promised." The tickets were more than just a gift. They symbolized the tangible results of their stand against the disrespect they'd faced, a reminder that their voices had been heard in a way they never imagined. Tanya felt a sense of pride that went beyond the compensation. It was about the message that was being sent, not just to them, but to every other passenger who might ever feel belittled or disrespected on a flight. "You know what this means," Chris said after a pause, his tone more playful. "We get a free vacation." Tanya laughed. "I think we've earned one." And so for the first time in months, Tanya and Chris started planning. They didn't know exactly where the tickets would take them, but that was part of the fun. They were looking forward to the freedom to choose their next adventure, an adventure they would approach with a new sense of purpose. They had fought for respect, and now they could enjoy the fruits of that effort. As the weeks went on, Tanya couldn't help but reflect on how everything had played out. She'd been changed by the experience, and so had Chris. What began as an uncomfortable, distressing moment had transformed into something more powerful. They hadn't just gotten back at the flight attendant. They had set in motion a shift that had made a real impact on a company, a ripple effect that extended beyond their personal experience. In a way, the free tickets were just a reminder of what they had done. They weren't necessary. They were symbolic. It was the change that mattered more than anything else. Tanya and Chris both knew that. They weren't looking for a reward, but it was clear the airline wanted to recognize what had been accomplished. Tanya spent some quiet moments thinking about the power of small actions. It had started with a simple complaint, a decision to stand up against something that wasn't right. That one moment had turned into an opportunity for growth, not just for them, but for an entire company. If that wasn't proof that speaking up mattered, she didn't know what was. But there was still the question of what came next. The email from Robert had confirmed that United Airlines was implementing significant changes. Tanya hoped these wouldn't be just temporary measures. She hoped they would become part of the airline's DNA, a lasting commitment to their customers. She had heard plenty of corporate promises in the past, but something about this felt different. The actions they had taken weren't just about fixing a single mistake. They were about reshaping the culture of an entire company. "Do you think they'll actually stick with it?" Tanya asked Chris one evening as they sat on the couch, planning out their next trip. The tickets were sitting on her desk, but her mind was still on the bigger picture. "I think so," Chris said thoughtfully. "I mean, they've already gone so far. They can't just go back now. And you can bet people are watching." Tanya nodded, her mind already turning over what she could do next. She had been a part of something important, and now that she knew the difference one voice could make, she didn't want to stop there. Who knew what other systems, what other places needed change just as much? But for now, she let herself enjoy the small victories. She had helped spark something bigger than herself, and that was enough for the moment. She looked at Chris and with a smile said, "Where should we go?" As they started discussing possible destinations for their free flights, Tanya knew that no matter where they went, it wouldn't just be a vacation. It would be a reminder of how far they had come, and how much farther they could still go. It wasn't long before Tanya and Chris found themselves standing at the counter of the United Airlines ticket desk, ready to redeem their round-trip tickets. They had decided on a trip to California, Los Angeles to be exact. The thought of sunny beaches, vibrant city life, and a change of scenery had been too tempting to pass up. As they checked in, Tanya couldn't help but think about how different this flight felt compared to the one that had started it all. Everything about this moment, the smiles from the staff, the efficient process at the counter, and the general atmosphere of calm, was a stark contrast to the tension-filled flight that had once made her feel small and unheard. It was clear that something had changed. The staff at the check-in desk was friendly and efficient, taking their details with a warmth that felt genuine. There were no signs of hostility, no dismissive attitudes. No one looked at them with annoyance or impatience. Tanya could feel the difference, and it was hard not to notice it. The airline was doing exactly what they had promised. The customer experience had improved, at least for her and Chris. As they made their way to the gate, Tanya found herself reflecting on how much this journey had come to mean to her. She had never expected one bad experience to turn into a catalyst for change. The journey they were on now wasn't just a vacation. It was a continuation of something that had started months ago. The airline's commitment to reform, the changes in their training, and the broader cultural shift they had promised, it all felt real now. Tanya wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was part of something bigger, a quiet force for change. Chris, noticing her thoughtful expression, nudged her gently. "You're thinking about the whole thing again, aren't you?" Tanya smiled, a little sheepishly. "Yeah, I guess I am." He grinned. "Well, it's hard not to. I mean, it's not every day you get to be a part of something that actually makes a difference. And now we get to enjoy the rewards." Tanya laughed, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd feel this way. At first it felt like just another bad experience that I had to get through. But now I can see how much it mattered, not just to us, but to other people too." Chris nodded in agreement. "Exactly. And we didn't just sit back and accept it. We said something. That's what made the difference." The announcement for their flight to Los Angeles came over the speaker, and the gate agents began to call passengers to board. Tanya and Chris stood up, ready to board, but Tanya felt a sudden rush of gratitude. It wasn't just about the tickets or the trip itself. It was about the realization that something so small, a single act of speaking up, had led to something much larger. And now they were on their way to enjoy the benefits of it. They had used their voice to make a change, and that change was still unfolding. As they walked down the jet bridge and into the plane, Tanya couldn't help but notice the staff's demeanor. The flight attendants greeted them warmly. The atmosphere was light, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to be there. She couldn't help but compare it to the earlier flight where Karen had been rude and dismissive. This was a completely different experience, and it was clear that things had changed. The plane took off smoothly, and as they ascended into the sky, Tanya looked out the window at the sprawling city below. For a moment, everything felt perfect. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the clouds, and there was a sense of calm and resolution settling inside her. Chris, noticing her gaze, leaned over. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" Tanya smiled and nodded. "I guess I am. It's hard not to. But I think I've finally made peace with it. We did something important, Chris. We stood up, and things changed because of it." Chris smiled back, his eyes twinkling with a mix of pride and satisfaction. "I'm proud of us, you've got to admit. It feels pretty good to know we made a difference." Tanya nodded. "Yeah, it really does." As they flew toward Los Angeles, Tanya felt the weight of the past few months lift off her shoulders. The tension that had hung in the air after that flight was gone. What had started as an uncomfortable, frustrating experience had become something that made her feel empowered, something that had taught her how to use her voice and stand up for what was right. And now, as they traveled toward their next adventure, Tanya realized that this wasn't just about the vacation. It wasn't just about the free tickets or the promise of future changes at the airline. It was about knowing that every choice she made, every time she stood up for herself and others, mattered. It was about creating a ripple effect that could change things for the better. And in this moment, high above the clouds, Tanya felt confident that the ripple would continue to grow. This was just the beginning. Tanya and Chris spent the next few days in Los Angeles, basking in the warm California sun and savoring every moment of their getaway. The trip was everything they had hoped for: relaxing, exciting, and, in many ways, healing. They explored the city, enjoyed delicious meals, and spent afternoons by the beach, watching the waves roll in. It was a much-needed break, a chance to step away from everything and just live in the moment. But even in the midst of their vacation, the impact of the events back home never fully left Tanya's mind. As they sat on the beach one evening, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink, she turned to Chris, her thoughts still lingering on everything that had transpired. She said slowly, "This whole experience, it really changed me. I never thought one little moment, something so simple, could turn into something that big." Chris smiled, reaching over to take her hand. "I know what you mean. It's like we unknowingly set something in motion. I didn't realize how powerful just speaking up could be." Tanya nodded, watching the waves crash against the shore. "I kept thinking, what if we hadn't said anything? What if we just let it slide? But now, looking at it all, I can see how much one action really can make a difference. It's like that old saying, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. But if you do stand up, things can change." The weight of her words settled between them, and for the first time in a while, Tanya felt a deep sense of peace. This whole journey had been more than just about the airline or the flight attendant. It had been about finding her own strength, about realizing that she had a voice worth listening to, and that standing up for what was right could lead to real change. Chris squeezed her hand. We didn't just change things for ourselves either. I mean, sure, we got the tickets, we got an apology. But those changes they made, those training programs, the customer service overhaul, those are going to affect everyone who flies with them. It's bigger than us now. Tanya smiled, feeling that sense of pride again. She had never imagined her actions would lead to such a broad-reaching shift. But it wasn't just the changes in the airline that mattered. It was what it meant for every person who would now feel valued and heard on their next flight. Every person who, like her, had ever felt dismissed or disrespected. She knew that they had done something meaningful, something that could reverberate for a long time. She let out a contented sigh, leaning back against the sand. I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we spoke up, even if I didn't fully realize the weight of it at first. I get it now. We made a difference. Chris turned toward her, his expression soft. And we'll keep making a difference every time we stand up for what's right. This is just the beginning. The sun was setting behind them, casting a golden glow across the ocean. And in that moment, Tanya felt truly at peace. She had learned something important about herself, about the power of her voice, about the courage to confront injustice, and about how one action, no matter how small, could start a ripple of change. As they stood up and made their way back toward the city, hand in hand, Tanya felt the weight of the past months lift off her shoulders. The anger, the uncertainty, the doubts, all of it was gone now. What remained was a deep sense of satisfaction and pride in knowing they had done the right thing. They had stood up, they had spoken out, and they had made a difference. This trip was more than just a vacation. It was a reminder that change starts with us. And as they walked down the beach toward the bustling streets of Los Angeles, Tanya knew that wherever life took her next, she would continue to speak up, continue to stand for what was right, because now, more than ever, she knew that her voice had the power to change the world, one small moment at a time. And with that thought in her heart, she took Chris's hand and walked into the future with confidence, knowing that no matter what came next, they had already made their mark. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.